So our worship pastor leaves, and all of a sudden, this is what we get. These guys are amazing, right? We got. Thank you. Thank you for being faithful, worship team, always doing the best you can to lead us in worship. What an awesome time to be able to sing with you guys here this morning. And to all of our mothers, one more time, Happy Mother's Day. You guys are amazing. I had a mother who showed and exemplified to me what service looks like, what it looks like to be a person who gives all the time. And so we know, mothers, the countless hours that you have spent, the thankless hours that you have spent throughout your entire life pouring into your children. And mothers of all ages, a happy Mother's Day to you. And one fun fact, we are all here today, I think, because we all have a mother, right? So that's one thing that we all have in common, is that we were birthed by a mother. What an amazing gift that God has given us for that. As we get started here today, we are in a series called Paradox. And we are looking at the words of Jesus and what he taught us. And specifically, what we're looking at is the contradiction. It looks like when Jesus says something, there's problems with what he said. It looks completely contradictory to anything that we might know in this world, and this is no exception to today's message. But when you pull back the curtain and you begin to pull back layers of what Jesus says, you begin to see the truth, and indeed it is the truth of God that we're going to find here today in the words of Jesus, but it seems contradictory to everything we know to be true. And I want to be honest, today's message hits me right between the eyes because I could think of many times when I've missed the mark specifically on this concept. And it has to do with being greatest in the kingdom of God. Being greatest in the kingdom of God. Now, when I was younger and I was growing up, my parents would drive down the street and the road, and I would be in the back seat with my sisters. And without fail, there would be some kind of ridiculous argument that would pop up. And it would sound something like this, like really, really dumb. Hey, Mom, Dad, he's looking at me. And like, I would never look at him, but he's looking at me. Or something like that. It was always like really stupid, really small, really insignificant. We made a big deal about it because we wanted to know that we were significant. We were important in our parents' eyes, right? That sibling rivalry was a real thing growing up. And then it's not just enough when we talk about being great. We can't just be great. We've got to be the greatest. Like the greatest. If you talk to sports fans, they're always talking about the greatest of all time or the GOAT. You can't just be great. You've got to be the greatest of all time, or if you're not the greatest of all time, then I guess you're really just kind of good, right? And so the idea of being the greatest, you have to rise up on that totem pole, and you've got to reach the highest level if you want to be great. I think that's something we learned when we're little, that if I can reach that position of greatness, now other people are going to think I'm great, and I've arrived. Sadly, I'm going to be honest with you, that's happened to me even in the church world. There's been times when I've thought to myself, God, have I achieved what I needed to achieve? Have I gone high enough up the rung? Have I done what I needed to do in order to know that I'm great? When I first started in ministry, I was a youth minister. And as a youth minister, people would say to me, hey, Mike, when are you going to become an actual minister or like a preacher, right? And I jokingly say, I don't want that demotion. I love working with youth. And the reality is that when you hear things like that enough, there's times in your mind you begin to think, well, is it just that I haven't arrived? Like maybe I'm not really doing what God wants me to do. Maybe I'm not serving effectively. And there's other times when I've heard other people talk, like people just starting off in ministry, and they'll say things like, hey, Mike, I want to work for that youth conference. I want to get up on stage. How can I get up on stage and talk at that youth conference? And I want to be honest with you. I'm just going to start off today by saying that when I talk to people like that, I respond to them by saying, I think you're asking the wrong question. If you think that you've arrived because you're on a platform or a stage, I want to tell you that's not how you arrive in the kingdom. In the kingdom, it's not about how great you are and the platform that you speak from and how many books you've written or how smart you are. What if I told you that's not the measurement that God has for us? See, the reality is I think it impacts and it infiltrates the church. A friend of mine wrote an article called The Lure of the Stage, and he talks about that it's problematic sometimes in our modern church culture. So I'm saying that, talking from a platform, saying, hey, it's not about the platform. As a matter of fact, when the disciples were asking Jesus who's greatest in the kingdom, they wanted to know that they were great. Jesus flips the entire thing on his head, and Jesus says, greatness isn't what you think it is. It's not about your position of authority. It's not about the role that you have. That's not what makes you great in the kingdom. And so without any further ado, I want you to picture this. In the back seat, Jesus driving down the road, and his kids in the back seat, the disciples, and they're arguing over who's going to be greatest in the kingdom. If you could picture that, that's what I'm picturing Jesus right now, with his kids in the back seat, the disciples, disagreeing and arguing and trying to find their place of authority in Dad's eyes. Okay, that's kind of how I picture this. And if you will, without any further ado, it's Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 40. And I've titled this Servant to All. Servant to All. We're going to see the words that Jesus has for his disciples. We start off seeing that James and John approach Jesus with a question. Now, James and John were two of the three closest disciples. We had Peter, James, and John. They were all the closest disciples to Jesus. In the most intimate, important parts of Jesus' ministry, he included Peter, James, and John. They were the most trusted. They had this no doubt closeness to Jesus. And so James and John, the brothers, the sons of Zebedee, they came up to Jesus and they asked him this question. And they do it with boldness. And here's the story. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus and they said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." You can see that. First of all, I think this can be misunderstood, because when we read that, when I first read that, I was like, how dare they go to Jesus and ask that kind of a question? Like, hey, Jesus, you're here to serve me. You're here to do what I ask you to do. But really, when you understand Jesus, he actually tells us we are to approach him with that kind of confidence. And the book of Hebrews says we should approach the throne of grace with confidence, because that's the relationship he wants us to have with him. But there's something that they get out of line here that Jesus begins to teach them. And so we want you to do whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you, James and John?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right and one at your left in your glory." Now, to a king, the person who sat at their right was the second in command, the second most powerful, okay? And so we find that throughout history. So when they're asking Jesus, "In your glory, we want to sit one at your right, one at your left," they're using kingship language. When you establish yourself as king, Jesus, we want to sit at your right and on your left. In other words, we want to be second and third in command only behind you, Jesus. That's what we're asking you for. Can you picture the other siblings hearing this conversation with Jesus? Can you picture the other disciples now? And can you picture the quabbling that comes from this, the disagreements, the frustration that they have towards James and John? Here's what it goes on to say. Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." Now, what Jesus is saying, if you remember, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he prays, "Let this cup pass from me." He's talking about the cup of suffering. So when they're asking, "Can I sit at your right and at your left?" what he's saying is, are you ready to drink from this cup of suffering? Are you ready to go down the same path that I'm getting ready to go down? Because if you're asking to sit at my right and my left, I don't think you understand. You're asking to be, like me, the suffering servant. You're asking to empty yourself out completely. Are you sure you're ready for that? They say, we are able. And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand and my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And again, the disciples are hearing this. They're stewing. You can picture that frustration that's starting to bubble up. Here's what I think, guys. Here's what I believe. I believe what the world teaches us and what we see every day is that we believe that greatness is linked to authority. We believe that greatness is linked to authority. If I can have more authority, then I will be greater. And if I'm greater, then I've arrived and I'm able to do what I need to do in life. That God will grant me ability because now I have more authority. And so we think that if we can climb that ladder and get more and more and more authority, now all of a sudden we arrive. Can I just say that is a very dangerous way to see the world? Jesus knew that. Jesus was telling him, my kingdom is not like that of the world at all. And he's getting ready to completely flip this upside down for them. So the disciples, they're indignant, they're frustrated because they hear this request from James and John. And Jesus is getting ready now to completely flip the script. And here's what he says. So when the 10 heard this, they began to be indignant at James and John, and Jesus called them to him, and he said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. They're great. Now they can exercise authority. These are the people who are not followers of Jesus. This is the way the world operates. They get more power, and they lord it over the people around them. Jesus says this, but it shall not be so among you. It's not that way among my disciples. You're not supposed to be that way. Don't ask to be greater because of your position. Don't think in those terms. And then he goes on to say, whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. Must be slave of all. Now, that's powerful language. We're going to talk about that here in a minute, why he says slave of all. But he says, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Here's what I believe. I believe while we think that we become great because of our authority, Jesus flips the script and he says greatness is linked to servanthood. In fact, if you want to be great in the kingdom, you need to be a servant. And that's your next fill in the blank, that Jesus taught greatness is linked to servanthood. If you want to be great in God's eyes, become a servant. Begin to see that your role in life is no important than anybody else's. In fact, strip yourself of your authority, strip yourself of what you think you deserve, and get down and begin to serve the people around you. I asked my sermon club, the people that we gather together on Mondays to talk through the sermon. I said, guys, what do you guys think a servant looks like? When you think of a servant, what does that look like to you? And this is the list that they came up with. They said, hey, number one, we think that a servant is selfless. If you want to be a servant, it means you've got to take yourself and you've got to strip yourself of anything that even remotely is about you. And so they're talking about being a servant, being somebody who gets rid of self and begins to realize I'm no important than anybody else. The next one is underappreciated. You know you're with a servant when you begin to almost sometimes take them for granted even. See, the reality is a lot of times servants are underappreciated. If I got a dime for every single time, or if you got a dime for every single time that I lost something, and then I shouted out, hey, Mom, could you help me find that? When I was growing up, guys, I would lose things, and she'd be like, it's not my job to do this, but she'd always know where it was, and she'd always help me find it. You see, my wife is like that too. You know, if I need something, she can jump up and she can help me with that. A servant does that, and it's easy to take servants for granted. They're underappreciated almost all the time. It's like almost impossible to show them the amount of appreciation that we want to give them and that they deserve. So servants can be underappreciated. Also, they're faithful. The thing about servants is they're always trying to think about how they can take care of and serve the people around them. And so if you think you're a servant, ask yourself that question. Am I faithful in regularly trying to take care of and serve the people around me? The next one is that they're giving. They're not taking. A servant isn't thinking about what they can get out of the situation. They're thinking about what they can give. They take the law of reciprocity, saying, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And they say, you know what, I'm going to scratch your back, whether you give me anything in return. That's what a servant does. The next one is they're attentive or they're mindful. They're looking for the situations. They're looking for ways that they can insert themselves and they can serve and they can help in their community. I love this one because the reality is sometimes we might serve and we might be helpful if it just stumbles upon us, but a servant is looking for ways that they can help, looking for ways they can make a difference. And along with that, they're compassionate. They think about the needs and the thoughts and the feelings of the people around them, and they engage in that. They realize this person has feelings, thoughts, and emotions, and I want to be able to engage with them and understand where they're coming from. A servant is good at that. Also, they're action-oriented. Servants don't just sit around and just say, hey, it would be nice someday to maybe do something for God. Servants jump up, and they are ready to move. They're ready to help, which is an amazing quality about a servant. Also, we said they're encouraging. The thing about a servant is servants leave situations better than when they came. When you're with a servant, you know it because you walk away and you feel encouraged, you feel loved, you feel valued because a servant has made you feel that way. You see, the reality is, and the scary reality is sometimes when we get this out of whack, We could walk into a situation, and then when we leave, people go, man, that person is they're a jerk, right? That's one of the words that we came up with. Like, what's the opposite of a servant? A jerk. And that happens sometimes. I'll tell you a quick story really quick. This is a bonus. I didn't bring this up in first service. There's a preacher that I know who shared a story about how after church on Sundays, he would go out and he would go out to eat with his family, along with a lot of other people in his congregation. And he went to one restaurant, and the server said, "Aren't you the preacher at that one church in town?" And he goes, "Well, yeah, I am a preacher at that church." And she said, "Oh." And she's kind of silent. And he goes, "What's that all about?" And she goes, "Well, it's just that Sundays after church, that's when everybody comes all dressed up in their Sunday best. And then they show up and they expect a really nice meal here at this restaurant. And they have these really high expectations. And to be honest with you, they're not always very nice to me. They want me to serve them and treat them really well. And then they don't even tip very well. And I just wanted you to know that, like, I'm sure that you're not doing that. You're not teaching your congregation to do that or anything like that. But if you could do me a favor, if you could just tell your congregation to be nicer after church on Sundays, that would be awesome." And it hit him right between the eyes, and he's like, "Oh, crud, what's the message we're sending as Christians when we leave this building? We come here, we learn about Jesus, but are we going to go and expect everybody else to cater to our every whim, or are we going to go and realize that we're servants at our core even when we leave this place?" Peter says it like this in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 16. He says, "Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God." And he's talking about the law. We're not slaves to the law. We're not servants to the law, but we can use our freedom to live in sin and to do whatever we want to in life. I'm free. But he says, don't use your freedom in that way. Instead, live as willing servants to God. We have chosen that God has given us everything, and so in response, we give him our very lives. That's freedom. Freedom is willingly serving God because we know that he has our best interests at mind, and that when we serve him, that's where God wants us. That's where God would have us. That's where we find life, is when we're serving a God like that. So that's what Peter says. I like the way Paul says it in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 5. Paul's a guy who had the resume. Talk about a resume. He could have gotten any job he wanted to. I mean, the reality is Paul had a resume that went on and on and on, and he talked about that. But this is what he said. He said, "I consider it all rubbish." I like the way he puts it here in this passage. He says, "For what we proclaim is not ourselves." We're not proclaiming ourselves. It's not about us and what we have done. That's not the point. We are here because of Jesus Christ. We proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord, with ourselves as servants of Jesus for Jesus' sake. We proclaim Christ. We're servants of Christ. It's not about us. We don't come here to lift ourselves up on a pedestal. We don't come here to lift ourselves up and make ourselves look good. Look at them. We live in a culture, a Christian celebrity culture, where we want to lift people up on a pedestal. That is so dangerous for us to do that. But do you know who should be lifted up on a pedestal? Jesus. Jesus. Jesus should be lifted up on a pedestal in all of our lives, and not just the preachers who are supposed to preach the gospel, but every single person in the church. You don't arrive once you stand on a stage. You arrive when you begin to serve the people around you. And that's what Jesus taught us. Jesus taught us that in John chapter 13, when he's with his disciples. This is this intimate moment he has with his disciples. I want you guys to read this with me. John chapter 13, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world, he was getting ready to die on a cross." This is right before that. "To the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And during supper, when the devil had already put it onto the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given him all things into his hands." Jesus had all authority. He had all power. He had all things given into his hands. What does he do with it? That he had come from God and that he was going back to God. He rose up from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, he tied it around his waist. He was letting everybody know there, I am getting ready to serve. He was putting on the towel of a servant. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a moment. And then he poured water into a basin, and he began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" And Jesus answered him, "What I am doing, you do not understand now, but afterwards you will understand." And Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." See, Peter is in a very confused state right now because Jesus is getting ready to wash his feet. And I want to share with you why he's confused. In order to do that, we need to understand a little bit of something about foot washing in Jesus' day. So what I've done is I provided a quick little thing, and you guys could fill in your own notes. There's a fill-in-the-blank section. If you have your notes and you want to follow along, write down whatever you want to, anything that you find of consequence or significant. If you want to bring it up in your small group or talk about it later with your family. Here's facts about foot washing in Jesus' culture. For many, many, many years, all the way back from the book of Genesis, we find foot washing that takes place in Scripture. And it was done as a daily practice because here's the reality. They walked around because of the climate either barefoot or with sandals, so their feet got dirty. And so due to the climate, they had to wash their feet. It would be like taking off your shoes when you come into your house. You don't want dirt traveling through your house. So foot washing became central in their culture and what they did. In the Mediterranean region, it was pretty mild there, so they didn't have to take baths every single day. They didn't have water. They didn't have a lot of access to water, but they did make sure that they had water to wash their feet. That was significant for them, so they did that every day. Most families had wooden or clay water tanks, though rich people had gold or silver vessels. So it was almost like you walk into somebody's house and you would judge them. "Oh, you must not have that much money. You must be like the rest of us peasants." You have a wooden tank. "Oh, you have a silver tank. Oh, you must be kind of a big deal. Oh, you have a gold tank. Ah, you must be rich. You must be really important," right? It was also a luxury to get your feet washed. That's another fun fact. We get your feet washed. That was a big deal. It was important. It was a luxury to have that happen. Also, it was done as an act of hospitality. When you walked into somebody else's house, they would offer to wash your feet. It was a standard practice. And it was done upon walking into your home. As soon as you walked in, you would wash your feet or have your feet washed. And here's a fact. It was done by the slave in bondage. So it was done by the lowest person in the home, by a slave in bondage even. This would be by somebody who absolutely was at the lowest of the totem pole. That is who would wash the feet in the home on a day-to-day basis. It was expected in their culture. If you're lowest on the totem pole, you wash my feet. And it was done before going to bed. Here's a fun fact about their culture. They'd wash their feet, and then they would get in bed, and if anybody knocked on their door, they would not answer. Be like, "Too bad I washed my feet." They wouldn't answer the door. All right. So if you need an excuse to not answer the door, just be like, "I washed my feet, leave me alone." Maybe it'll work. We'll see. Practice of foot washing was also a luxury upon returning home. We see this happen with David when he was talking to Uriah. He encouraged Uriah to go down to his house and to wash his feet. "You've earned it, Uriah. You have served well." Of course, Uriah doesn't know what's getting ready to happen next. David had these ulterior motives and ultimately would cost Uriah his own life. But he wanted Uriah to know, "You've earned it. You have the right to go down and wash your feet." But Uriah's like, "Absolutely not. The rest of my people, they're in battle right now. I'm not going to go home and kick up my feet. I'm not going to wash my feet and do something that the rest of my men can't." Because Uriah had integrity. He would not go and wash his feet. He would not go and be with his wife. He would not go home. Instead, he treated himself like a servant. You see, the reality is, Uriah understood a principle about life. He was no better than anybody else. He was no better than the other people. He didn't earn the right to go back and do that when they were still back in battle. We find out more about foot washing. It was also done as an act of respect or honor towards a rabbi or teacher. People would wash their rabbi or their teacher's feet. They made it a point to do that. If it was a king, somebody under them, a servant, would wash their feet. The reality is, in that culture, people would wash the feet of people that they held honor and respect to. And then also, it was done as a religious ceremony or ritual. And I want you guys to hang tight on this one because this comes back here in a moment. You see, in the Torah, priests are required to wash their hands and feet before entering the holy place of the tabernacle to offer sacrifices on the altar. Moses receives these commandments in Exodus chapter 30, verses 17 through 21. Exodus chapter 40, verses 30 through 32 describes these instructions. 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 38, and 2 Chronicles 4:6 mention 10 basins, 40 baths in which the priests were to wash. Also, the high priest is expected to wash his hands and feet on the Day of Atonement. The ceremonial cleansing before you enter into God's presence, you must be washed. Not just your hands, but your feet and the rest of your body as well. Your head, your hands, and your feet were the three parts about your body that needed to be washed, especially in a ceremonial cleansing. So, listen to what happens. Let's go back to this story here in John chapter 13. Because where we left off, Peter told Jesus, there's no way I'm going to let you wash my feet. It's not happening. And you can picture Peter's like, I have no context for this. There's no reason why you should be washing my feet. And he was a strict adherent to the Torah. One thing about Peter is he may have had some character issues because he was so firm about things, and maybe some people would see that as a bad thing, but he was sure of himself. Jesus, I'm not going to let you wash my feet. There's no reason why you should be. There's no contextual reason for you to be down washing my feet. No, Jesus, no. He didn't want to offend Jesus. And so he made it clear, I can't do this, Jesus, I can't do this. So let's look back at this again. Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me. And then Simon Peter said to him, Lord, then, not just my feet, but also my hands and my head. Did you catch that? The ceremonial cleansing. This must be a ceremonial cleansing then, Jesus. Wash all of me. Make sure that I'm clean, Jesus. Make sure that I'm clean. And then it goes on to say, Jesus said to him, the one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean. Well, not every one of you. For he knew that he was going to be betrayed. And that was why he said, not all of you are clean. You see, when he washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, do you understand what I have done to you? And listen to these words. You call me teacher and Lord. In other words, you put me in a place of reverence. You call me those things. You know that's who I am. There's no reason for me to be down washing your feet. Culture teaches you that's not supposed to happen. There's no context for this. Peter, you're right. There's no context for this. I'm not supposed to be down doing this according to the world. He goes, so then if that's true, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you. Jesus tells them clearly, I'm doing this as an example. Look, if you want to call me teacher and Lord, if you think you're better than me, then you don't have to wash other people's feet. But if you truly do mean it when you say teacher and Lord, you've got to learn to get down and you've got to learn to wash the feet of the people around you, because it's not about your position. It's not about sitting on my right or sitting at my left. It's about making yourself the least of all of these. That's what I need from my disciples, Jesus says. Jesus knew he was getting ready to lay his life down. And I just want to say, I believe with all of my heart that Jesus was teaching them a lesson, that we must serve even in places of authority. We must serve even in places of authority, and that's your next fill in the blank. We must serve in places of authority. The reality is, just because we've arrived and we've gotten to a certain place, that doesn't mean that we're exempt from serving. Jesus actually tells us the contrary. If you get to a certain place where you've become successful in the world's eyes, just remember there's a different definition of success from God's eyes. You could be successful in the world's eyes, and you could have greatness in the world's eyes and be absolutely missing the mark in God's eyes. But you could also be a CEO. You could be the president of the United States. You can have places of great power and authority in the world's eyes and choose to exercise that by getting down and washing the feet of the people around you. That's what Jesus teaches us. The more you think you've arrived, the more of a responsibility we have at that point to now serve the people around us, to get down on our hands, to be able to wash the feet of those in need. It's about servanthood. You imagine Jesus making himself the slave of all? That's what's happening here. He made himself the slave in that circumstance, and he washed the feet of the people around him. But guess what? Servanthood isn't just for people who have a position of authority. Servanthood is for people who have positions that don't seem like they have a lot of authority either. In fact, it comes from the weirdest of places. Jesus tells us, we find the story in Luke chapter 7, something that happens to him directly, and it is a scandalous story. There's one more thing I want to tell you. That the people who washed the feet, it was the wives who washed the feet of their husbands. And the reason why that's important is for this reason. Because it was seen as an intimate thing. So a servant could wash the feet of the man, but that's not going to happen if the wife is in the house, because the wife would not allow that to happen, because it was seen as a privilege and an honor to wash the feet of her husband. And so we find this story here that's absolutely scandalous on lots of different levels. It's a crazy story. That's why there's so much weird judgmentalism that's happening in this story. I want you to read this story. It's Luke chapter 7, verses 36 through 50. And it says, one of the Pharisees asked Jesus to eat with him. And he went into the Pharisee's house, and he reclined at the table. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner. When she learned that Jesus was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. One more fun fact. In Jesus' day, it would have been rare, but one thing that would happen if you wanted to show absolute honor, absolute respect to somebody after you wash their feet is you anoint their feet with this ointment, this oil. So she takes this super expensive oil, and now she decides she's going to anoint his feet. And I got to tell you, this is a scandalous moment now. So now the Pharisee who invited him into his house, this is happening in his house, and he can't believe it. He's beside himself. And he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this was that was touching him, for she is a sinner, and he would not allow for this to happen. How can he call himself a prophet? No. This is scandalous. This can't happen in my house. And then Jesus, understanding what he was thinking, it literally says answering him. We don't even know that he said anything out loud. He thought it to himself. So he answered him. He said, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he said to him, say it, teacher. A certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. And when they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now let me ask you, which of them will love him more? And Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And he said to him, you have judged rightly. And then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, using the woman as an example, he says to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered into your house. Listen to these words. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears, and she wiped them with her hair. Scandalous. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, common practice, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. She has shown me the ultimate sign of love and honor and respect. Simon, you didn't do any of those things for me. You might think that you have a position of authority. Yes, I'm in your house. But look at this woman. This sinner, this prostitute, this horrible woman in your eyes. And then he says, therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much, but he who is forgiven little loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. And then those who were at the table with him began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Here's a woman who understood something fundamentally that you and I need to understand. It doesn't matter our story. It doesn't matter our background. It doesn't matter our position. It doesn't matter if we're high. It doesn't matter if we feel like we're low. It's about what we do with what we know about Jesus. It's about being his servant and being his man and his woman in the moment when it matters most. And in this story, Jesus peels back the layers and he shows not only is this woman not doing anything scandalous, she's become a servant. And that's what I need you to be too. It's easy for us to stand back and to think that we've earned the right to be served. It's easy for us to stand back and think that we've arrived. Well, finally, I made it. I'll let everybody else serve me. And yeah, I'll treat them like garbage when they don't do what I want them to do. Oh, God, forgive us. Forgive us when our witness to the world is that their job is to serve us. May that never be the case with us at LifeSpring. May we be servants to the end. May we take our last breath knowing that we served Jesus with everything we had. The takeaway, guys, is this. The servant is greatest because they give their life to God. That's the takeaway. The servant is greatest because they give their life to God. It's not because they have earned the right, but the servant is greatest because they have given their life to God. They have laid it down. They have made it, let it be known that it's about pointing people to Jesus. There's no one who is beneath you. In fact, Jesus says our job is to be the slave of all. Our job is to make ourselves beneath the people around us. And when we get down and we wash the feet of even the slaves, when we get down and we wash the feet of everybody in our home, it sends a statement, and that statement is, I might be in your eyes, your teacher or your rabbi, but I want to tell you, I'm your servant first, always. And in that kind of leadership, it changes lives. That kind of leadership points people towards Jesus because that's exactly who Jesus is, who gave his life as a ransom for many. He served us to the end. The reason why we're here today is because he willingly laid down his life on a cross. Christians, if you're here today, you know that Jesus spread out his arms and he died on a cross. That was the cup that he chose. And when we say, hey, Jesus, I want to stand on your right and on your left, his response is, are you ready to drink that cup too? Are you ready to empty yourself completely, just like I have done? That's the call. That's the call of the servant leader. And so I just want to just commission us, LifeSpring, all of us here today, what your position is at work, what your position is in your home, whatever you think it is. It's not about how high you are and how great, how much you've accomplished. It's about what you've done to serve Jesus. So as you are successful in life, or whatever that looks like, if we're not serving, we're not doing what Jesus asked us to do. But on the contrary, no matter where we think we are, no matter how successful we think we are, that's not success. Where we've accomplished in the world's eyes, that's not what makes us successful. What makes us successful, what makes us great, is when we empty ourselves, just like Jesus did. We pour ourselves out. We point people towards a God who loves them more than they could ever imagine, a God who willingly served them to the end.